If your wife left the house at 10 p.m., would you be concerned? No, because all I have to do is turn on the local news to find out what she's doing. My wife, Carol Martin, is a local nightly news co-host at a top local TV station in Birmingham. She's as gorgeous as she is smart, and many smart people are betting that her next job will be in a major market, perhaps Atlanta or Chicago. There is even talk that she may get an offer from a New York channel, which is the promised land for a news anchor. I'm Tom Bailey, by the way. Carol kept her maiden name for the broadcast. Many female announcers do this to separate their personal lives from their professional lives. I think you can tell how proud I am of her and how lucky I am to have married her. We met while we were both attending the University of Alabama at Tuscaloosa. As you might guess, she majored in broadcasting and I majored in marketing. We met at a fraternity party our freshman year and I was overwhelmed. She was tall, blonde, with curves in all the right places. Me? I'm a pretty outgoing guy, but I wasn't an athlete and wasn't destined to be the big man on campus. And for some reason, no one ever suggested I model for GQ magazine. But something happened between us, and we soon became a couple. I'm not going to lie and say everything was always perfect. We fought a lot and once broke up for 2 weeks. But by the second weekend, I was going crazy, missing her and cursing myself for letting it all come between us. I finally started running across campus to her dorm, hoping that she would forgive me and we could be together again. Halfway there, I looked up and saw her running in my direction. If there had been a movie camera here, it would have circled around the two of us as we hugged each other with tears in our eyes, vowing never to part again. We were, as they say, madly in love. By senior year, we were engaged. We were already living together in a small off-campus apartment, but at least we had the sense to wait until after graduation before committing ourselves to marriage. Besides, she wanted to have a big wedding, and her family was wealthy enough to indulge her. I was smart enough to realize that I should go along with her, so we were married in the Canterbury Chapel on campus in May, a week after graduation. Carol was fortunate enough to get a job at a local TV station in Huntsville as a weekend weather anchor. It wasn't a very prestigious position, but broadcasting jobs are hard to come by, even in small markets. It was a start, and Carol tried to make the most of it. After 6 months, she got the opportunity to report on air, and after a few more months, she moved to a full-time job. I managed to get a low-level job at a local advertising agency. The place was so small that I was doing double duty as an account representative and copywriter. It wasn't much, but it was good experience and much better than being unemployed. But she didn't have to stay there long because Carol's star was already rising. By the end of the year, she was offered a job as a reporter at the largest station in Mobile. Her good looks and persuasive personality attracted the attention of the station's management, and we moved to the Gulf Coast. I didn't mind being the tail end of our relationship. I knew what I was getting into from the moment Carol got her first on-air job, and my ego was strong enough to support her career. Of course, it didn't hurt that by the time we moved to Mobile, she was making more money than I was. The station management in Mobile was well connected with local advertising agencies, and with their help, I managed to get a job with one of the big firms in the city. The people there were pleasant, and I fit in without difficulty. Carol, meanwhile, was doing even better. She joined the station as a reporter, but when a vacancy arose, she was given the chance to be a weekend newscaster. People loved her, and the ratings for her newscast began to steadily increase. Soon she moved on to the coveted position of nightly news co-host. If viewers loved her as a presenter, they went into a frenzy when she announced on air that she was expecting a baby. They followed her in ever-increasing numbers through every stage of her pregnancy, and when our daughter Susan was born, the birth became news in its own way. While our beauty was growing and developing, the station used the opportunity to produce a documentary series about the challenges faced by a mother of a newborn baby returning to work, which won a regional Emmy Award. Given the success Carol was enjoying, it was no surprise that WXYY, a top station in Birmingham, called and offered her a co-host position. We had grown accustomed to the relaxed pace of life on the Gulf Coast in Mobile, and we were sad to say goodbye. I had made real friends at the agency where I worked, and I was truly sorry to have to leave them. But Birmingham beckoned, and we couldn't help thinking that if Carol did well there, even greater things were ahead of us. So we sold our cozy little house, packed our bags, and headed for the big city. Some might scoff at calling Birmingham a big city, but with a population of 1.2 million and the 40th largest media market in the country, Pittsburgh South was a major step up for Carol, especially in the broadcast media arena. After being so comfortable in Mobile, I was cautious about moving to Birmingham, but there was no need to worry. Armed with recommendations from my friends in Mobile and with the help of Birmingham Station, I was able to find a great job at the city's second-largest advertising agency. In fact, I can't say enough good things about the station's management. They hooked us up with a knowledgeable real estate agent who helped us find a great house in the suburb of Hoover. She also helped us find a great daycare for baby Susan. All in all, the move went much easier than I expected, and we settled into our new life quickly and painlessly. I have to tell you a little about our daily routine, because being the husband of a television journalist is not a normal way of life. I got up in the morning, made breakfast, and went to work, leaving Carol and Susan to sleep. Carol would stay in bed as long as Susan would let her sleep, and then get up and spend the morning with her daughter. After lunch, Carol would take Susan to Mrs. Alsop's house. Mrs. Alsop was a sweet woman who took care of Susan and the other two children, as well as her own daughter. She had experience in elementary school, so in addition to playing games, she introduced her charges to some of the concepts they might encounter in kindergarten and first grade. I would pick Susan up from work, bring her home, and cook dinner for us, including what could be saved so Carol could eat when she got home. After dinner, I would bathe Susan and read to her until it was time to put her to bed. Then I would read or watch TV until Carol finally came home. Often, she had to wake me up on the couch where I had fallen asleep. As for Carol, after leaving Susan with Mrs. Alsop, she would go to the station and arrive at 3 o'clock to begin preparations for the evening news. Then, while the news was on, Carol would go for makeup and one last check before the 6 o'clock broadcast. She and fellow anchor Ted Stevenson would get ready for the local news hour. After they finished, they'd have a light snack. They never ate closer to airtime to avoid embarrassing burps and regurgitations, and get ready for the 10 p.m. newscast. Normally, Carol and Ted took turns on the air at 10 p.m. Since the late news lasts only 30 minutes, only one anchor is needed. But lately, Don Sanchez, the news director, has been doing postmortems after the late newscasts, and Carol and Ted have had to stay late to analyze their performances and find ways to improve. Local news programs bring a lot of money to TV stations. Stations keep all the advertising revenue, and the station with the highest rating gets a premium, so competition is fierce. The higher the rating, the higher the premium, so stations are constantly looking for ways to increase their audience share. Being in the advertising business, I could understand why the station put so much emphasis on boosting ratings. But as a husband, I also felt the lack of time alone with Carol. Truth be told, with Carol working evenings and me working afternoons, it was always a challenge to find time for just the two of us, especially after Susan was born. Sure, we usually had weekends off, but we tried to find some time during the week as well. But lately, those evening meetings have become less and less frequent, especially after Don Sanchez instituted late-night autopsies. Even weekends have become less frequent as Carol has made more public appearances, showing the flag for the station. With rare opportunities for intimacy, it seemed that Carol and I lived more as neighbors than as husband and wife, as friends rather than lovers. Because our schedules didn't coincide, I rarely found an opportunity to discuss the situation with her, and she seemed reluctant to talk about it with me, I suppose, because there were no easy answers. Even though I wasn't happy with the situation, I didn't want to bring it up because I knew what I was getting into when I married Carol. We discussed the timeline and difficulties of marriage with the TV hostess, and I agreed to everything. Moreover, we had friends from college who were struggling with the opposite situation. Husbands often traveling and working long hours with little time for family. If I were in that situation, I would turn to Carol for support and understanding, so I didn't want to be hypocritical. Besides, I reminded myself, Carol made a lot more money than I did, which made our lives a lot easier. Still, money wasn't everything. It got to the point where I couldn't keep my frustration to myself any longer. So one day at lunch, I laid it all out to Lou Faraday, the media director at our agency. Lou was only a couple years older than me, was married to a beautiful woman named Terry, and had a little daughter a little older than Susan. Given that we had so much in common, it was no surprise that he became my best friend at work, and someone I felt comfortable turning to for advice. So the day he told me about how happy he and Terry were, I instinctively said, "Damn, I wish I had what you have." "Looks like trouble in paradise, buddy," he said. "What's going on?" Then it all came pouring out, surprising me with how bad I felt. "I'm married to one of the finest women on television," I grumbled, "and I don't see her any more often than I see her fans on the news." Lou shook his head sympathetically. "Damn, Tom, this sucks. Can't you go on vacation sometime, or at least a long weekend? I bet your folks would love to keep Susan with them." "I thought about it," I said, "but Carol says Don Sanchez keeps pushing Ted and her to get the ratings up. They're his best viewers, and he's afraid their absence will lead to some ratings drop they can't make up for. Look, Lou replied, I've known Don Sanchez for quite some time. He's a talented news director and eager to succeed, but he's also a decent man. Maybe you should talk to him and see if there's anything he can do to give you and Carol some time together. I don't know, Lou, I sighed. I think Carol would kill me if she found out I'd contacted her boss. She doesn't need to know, Lou replied. Don's coming to the agency tomorrow to hear a presentation on the new viral video campaign we're working on. You know him well enough. I bet you can snatch a few minutes to talk to him after we're done. I don't want to ruin your mood, Lou, I said. My personal problems don't belong in the office. Don't be silly. This is just a preliminary meeting. Don wanted to see how we were progressing with the concept, and we invited him to stop by. This will be a great opportunity for you to pull him aside and talk about you and Carol. I was still wary, but I couldn't think of anything better to do. My resolve was strengthened that evening when Carol arrived even later than usual. She didn't even bother to wake me up on the couch where I had dozed off waiting for her. Instead, I woke up on the couch in the middle of the night to find the TV off and a wet pillow where I had drooled in my sleep. I dragged myself upstairs, undressed, and climbed into bed next to her sleeping figure. Shit, I thought. Now I won't even get a chance to kiss her goodnight. When I got to the office the next day, I was determined to do something to try to change the pattern our lives had become. So I kept my eyes on the conference room where Don Sanchez was meeting with Lou and a few of his guys. As their meeting began to dissolve, I poked my head through the door and waved at Don. He was clearly in a good mood. Hey Tom, how's my favorite news anchor's husband doing? He shouted to me. Hey Don, it's good to see you. Listen, do you have a couple minutes? I asked. Sure, what's on your mind? He asked cheerfully. I decided to take it easy. Hey, you need to give Carol a break. You're working her too hard, I said, frowning. But he took me seriously, and a look of concern appeared on his face. Did she complain? He asked quickly. No, she likes it, I replied. I am the one who suffers. I don't see her anymore. He relaxed. Oh, well, you knew she had a dangerous job when you married her, he joked. He could see that he was relieved that his star wasn't upset. Sure, I agreed, but all these special appearances and post-show autopsies really cut into her, and I's alone time. I tried to soften my complaint with a wink. Okay, he snapped back. We've probably overdone the showing the flag thing. I'll see if we can't lighten the schedule. And don't worry about the autopsies. We haven't done one since the last rankings came out. Have you seen how much we're outranking the competition? Station management is ecstatic. Speaking of leadership, he continued, I've got to get back there for my next meeting. It was good to see you. Keep pleasing your bride. With those words, he patted me on the back, turned and headed for the door, leaving me standing in his office. Back at my desk, all I could think about was when the last set of ratings came out. I checked my computer, our agency is a subscriber, and verified that the last rating had been published a whole month ago. If Don hadn't performed an autopsy in a month, what was Carol doing all those nights when she got home from work so late? That question shook me to the core. Maybe it was because I was already unhappy with our relationship. But the first thought that came to me was, she's having an affair. As soon as I thought about it, I realized I was wrong. Carol loved me, and although the relationship was a bit strained, she wouldn't do anything that would jeopardize our marriage. Besides, there were plenty of other perfectly reasonable reasons why she might have stayed away like that. Maybe she just wanted to unwind a little, maybe stop in for a late-night snack. Maybe she had fallen behind on fan mail and was trying to catch up. There were tons of reasons she could have been late. So why didn't that make me feel better? At that moment, Lou poked his head through the door. Hey, I saw you talking to Don. Did he give you any relief? I'm not sure, Lou. I guess I won't know until I talk to Carol. He gave me a perplexed look, but when I didn't say anything else, turned to leave. Okay, buddy, let me know if there's anything I can do. For the rest of the day, I was like a zombie. I went about my business. Anyone who passed by my office would have thought I was working hard. But I couldn't concentrate on any of my projects. My thoughts kept returning to what Don had said. I tried to remember exactly what Carol had said when I asked her about the late hours. Most of all, I was thinking about what I was going to do next. Part of me wanted to confront her and demand an explanation. But no sooner had I chosen that option than another part of me thought about how stupid I'd look if the explanation turned out to be completely innocent. Accusing her of having an affair certainly wouldn't improve my relationship with Carol, I knew. And as I rationalized my fears, another voice in my head started calling me a wuss for not asserting myself and demanding the truth. By the time I left work to pick up Susan, I was no closer to solving the problem than I had been before. The only silver lining was that I now had an active, demanding 4-year-old in my arms, and being her daddy took up almost all of my attention and energy for the next few hours. Perhaps she sensed my mood, because she was unusually clingy that evening and didn't want me to stop reading to her in bed. Finally, she fell asleep. As I tiptoed out of the room, I looked back at her sleeping, innocent face and was surprised to find tears welling up in my eyes. How sad it would be if her mom and dad were getting a divorce. Emotionally exhausted, I went back to my room and sat down in front of the TV. At that moment, I realized that I didn't have the energy for confrontation. For a whole hour, I watched some pointless police drama, but after that, I couldn't remember anything about the plot. Then the news came on, and I watched my beautiful wife recount the day's events. Looking at her carefully made-up face during the talking head footage, I remembered how I had been so enamored with her all those years in college. Of course, this bright, beautiful woman wouldn't cheat on me. It was well past midnight when I heard her car pull into the driveway and she got out of the garage. When she saw me, she looked surprised. "Oh, I didn't realize you were still up." I got up from the couch, walked over to her, and hugged her. "I just wanted to see you. I've missed you. You're awfully late tonight." She gave me a quick kiss and pulled away to bend over and take off her shoes. "Yeah, sorry about that. Don held us up again because of one of his damn autopsies," she said. "I'm very tired, dear. I'm going to head to bed." Without waiting for me, she turned and headed up the stairs. I turned off the TV and sat in the dark. Oh, God, I thought. She just lied to me. Once again, the argument between the warring parties raged in my head. Maybe she wasn't lying. Maybe Don really did call for another screening session. That doesn't make any sense. Don told you today that he hasn't held a session in a month. And after you brought it up, he certainly wouldn't call a special session today. I didn't want to believe that my wife was cheating on me. But I also didn't want to be an unwitting cuckold who hid his head in the sand rather than face the truth. What was the truth? When I went up to the bedroom, Carol was sound asleep. I lay down beside her, but sleep wouldn't come to me. The next day, I stopped by Lou's office and asked him to have lunch with me. When he looked up at me, he must have seen something in my face that stopped him from his usual witticisms. "And Lou," I added, "please plan on a long lunch." Now he looked at me very seriously, but only nodded and said, "Sure thing, buddy." I dropped by his office around 11:15 and suggested we have lunch at a place a couple miles from the office, where we were unlikely to see anyone else from work. We drove to the restaurant in silence. I didn't want to get into a conversation and stop, and he realized I wasn't interested in small talk. When we ordered our lunches, I hesitated for a moment, not knowing where to begin. He looked at me sympathetically and said, "It's Carol, isn't it?" His comment was like cauterizing a boil, and all the unpleasant, contagious stuff seemed to pour out of me. He listened silently, letting me spill out all my fears and insecurities. When I eventually ran out, he shook his head. "Damn, I never would have believed it. I thought you and Carol had the happiest marriage in the world." "Me too, Lou, me too," I nodded sadly. "So what are you going to do?" he asked. His simple question seemed to crystallize my thoughts. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there and agonize anymore. "Lou," I said, "the only thing I can think of is to go to the station and see for myself what's going on there. If I'm wrong and everything is perfectly innocent, hopefully I'll be able to sneak out of there undetected, and Carol will never know what an insecure idiot I've been." "What if you're right?" asked Lou quietly. "I don't know, Lou, but at least I'll know where I stand. It's better than the agony I'm going through right now." "What about Susan?" he asked. "I've already thought of that," I told him. "When we get back from lunch, I'll call Mrs. Alsop and ask if she can keep Susan late tonight. She's already offered to do that, so hopefully there won't be a problem." We finished lunch and headed back to the office. I was still distraught, but at least I had a plan of what to do to resolve the situation. I guess even those condemned to death feel some relief when the day of execution finally arrives. Mrs. Alsop said she would be glad to help, but asked me not to stay too long. "Please be back no later than 11 o'clock, she told me. "I have to start work first thing in the morning." It didn't give me much time to see anything, but it was the best I could get, so I promised. After work, I drove again to Mrs. Alsop's house to inform Susan of the change of plans. At first, my girl wept when she realized I wasn't coming to pick her up, but Mrs. Alsop came to the rescue. "We're having a pizza party, Susan," she told her, and Susan visibly brightened at the thought. I paid Mrs. Alsop for the extra time and also gave her money to order pizza for everyone. It was the least I could do. Then I headed for the exit before Susan could get upset again. Now the only question left was how to kill a few hours. I went home and made myself something to eat. Then I picked up my plate for half an hour before I threw the food in the trash. I should have realized that there was no way I was going to eat. I cleaned up the kitchen and started rummaging around the house, looking for a way to distract myself. The more I thought about it, the worse I felt about my plan. The news wouldn't end until 10:30. How much could happen in the next 30 minutes? Worse yet, what if Carol came straight home? She might beat me to it before I can pick up Susan and get back to the house. What would I say then? All these doubts and fears paralyzed me until I remembered the determination I'd felt at lunch with Lou. I had to do something, even if it failed. I just couldn't leave it at that. By then, it was almost 10 o'clock. My plan was to go to the station during the newscast, go in just before it ended, and see what I could find. Usually there weren't many people at the station at this late hour. Just an engineer, 2 cameramen, and a sound technician. Hopefully, there would be no other visitors, and I would be able to go unnoticed. When I got to the studio, I immediately realized my mistake. There in the hall was old John, the night watchman. I'd forgotten all about him. He knew me from previous visits, so there was no problem getting in, but I would have had to sign in. So much for stealth. When he saw that I had entered, he looked at me curiously. "Good evening, Mr. Bailey," he said. "Come to see the news?" "Right," I said and signed the log. He looked at me with a strange sympathy. "There won't be a problem, will there?" "Oh no, of course not," I quickly replied and walked back to the studio. What did he mean by that? I wondered. And then it hit me. He knows. Oh shit. I returned to the set and peeked through a gap in the blackout curtains. The news had just ended, and Carol was taking down the lavalier microphone. Then she headed toward her dressing room. I circled the studio to follow her, but to my surprise, Carol didn't go to her dressing room, but headed down the hall to the green room. The green room is where guests can wait and rest before going on the air. But the 10 o'clock news never has guests, I thought, and indeed the whole room was plunged into darkness. When she opened the door, however, I saw that one of the table lamps inside was lit, and discerned a male figure sitting in one of the chaise lounges. Then the door closed, and no light or sound came from inside. My heart was pounding, and I didn't know what to do. The door was unlocked, and I could burst in and demand an explanation. But if it was an innocent encounter, if Don Sanchez was there, for instance, Carol would never forgive me. If I stayed outside, I'd never know what was going on. I was just about to rush inside and end the aftermath when I remembered something. There was a small window on the far side of the room that allowed station personnel to unobtrusively check on guests without disturbing them. In fact, it was Carol who had pointed it out to me when she gave me a tour of the station when we first arrived. I quickly headed in the direction where the observation window was. As I walked, I checked the time. Damn it. It was already 10:45. I would have to leave quickly to make it to Mrs. Alsop's house by 11 o'clock. I moved down the darkened hallway and saw a faint light coming through the small observation window. As I peered through it, I saw Carol clearly. I had never seen such a set of underwear in my life. She was encased in a tight embrace with a man as if she belonged to him, which I suppose at the moment she did. I pulled out my cell phone and started taking video. The lighting was low, but the black underwear seemed to make the light on her skin much brighter. I knew what was coming next, and I wanted to end it right here and now. But as I turned and headed back toward the door, I glanced at the time. It was almost 11:55. Damn it, I had to pick up Susan. I ran down the hallway to the lobby and nodded to Joe, heading for the front door. "I'm sorry, Mr. Bailey," he said. Damn, I thought, does everyone but me know what's going on? I jumped into the car and sped toward Mrs. Alsop's house. When she let me in, I found my Susan asleep. Wrapping her in a blanket, I took her in my arms, picked up my things, and turned to leave, thanking Mrs. Alsop for keeping her. She looked at me strangely and asked, "Are you all right, Mr. Bailey?" When I stared at her blankly, she said, "Your eyes." Only then did I realize that tears were streaming down my cheeks. "Oh, that," I said. "It's nothing. I just got something in my eye when I was getting out of the car." I thanked her again and carried Susan to the car, fastening her seatbelt, although she was still wrapped in the blanket. I don't think she woke up as we drove home, and I know she continued to sleep as I carried her up the stairs and put her in her bed. She looked so sweet and innocent, and I was overcome with longing for the innocence I had lost tonight. I got a beer out of the fridge and sat in the darkened room waiting. Everything was quiet. Strangely, a memory of my grandmother's death flashed through my mind. I walked into the chapel where her coffin stood and realized that the silence then was intensified by my deep sadness. I felt the same way now. When she got home, it was almost 1 o'clock in the morning. She went into the kitchen and turned on the light. When she saw my figure in the unlit room, she was surprised. "Tom, what are you doing?" "I've been waiting for you," I said in an even, emotionless voice. "The security guard told me you came by the studio. Is everything okay with Susan?" "Where is she?" "Mrs. Alsop held her up for me. She's upstairs in bed now." "Well, if you came to the studio, why don't you stop by my place?" I tried to pull myself together. This was it. "I saw you tonight. I saw you go into the green room with Ted Stevenson." "Oh yeah, we just had a little meeting after the news." "Carol, I came to the observation window. I saw what your meeting was about. I even got a glimpse of the new set of underwear you were hiding from me." At least she had the decency to look embarrassed. "Oh, Tom, I'm so sorry." Now my anger was building. "Are you sorry you did it, or just sorry you got caught?" "Tom, I'm sorry you saw us like that." "I didn't want you to find out this way," she said quietly. "You're going to leave me for him?" She dropped to her knees in front of me and took my hands in hers. "Oh, honey, don't even think like that. Of course I'm not going to leave you. This is just my little adventure, a little fling. Maybe it will be over soon and then everything will go back to normal." I couldn't believe my ears. "It'll be over soon? You mean you're not going to stop? You're going to keep cheating on me?" "Baby, this doesn't mean anything. This is just a chance for me to experiment a little with Ted. It won't last long. Just let me have my fun and then I'll come back to you like I always do." "I can't believe it, Carol. You're asking me to agree to be a cuckold while you two entertain each other whenever you want. How could you think I would agree to that?" She stood up and stepped back to look at me. Her voice was quiet and had lost all its warmth. "Tom, you really don't have a say." "You don't have a say? I'm your husband, for heaven's sake. If you don't stop this, I'll have no choice but to file for divorce." She looked at me coldly. "I really don't think it's in your best interest, Tom." Her calm demeanor made me even angrier. I wanted her to show some remorse, to apologize, or at least acknowledge the pain I was feeling. Instead, she talked me into accepting her behavior and pretending that nothing was going on. I couldn't believe it. "Given your actions today, I will decide for myself what is in my best interest. And I can tell you that I'm not going to stand for it." She crossed her arms over her chest and spoke to me as if she were lecturing a delinquent child. "Tom, listen to me. If you file for divorce, you're going to lose. You'll lose your daughter because the court will award custody of Susan to me. You'll only get to see her a couple weekends a month, plus your birthday and some holidays. No matter how we divide our assets, I'll get the house because I'll be raising Susan. And of course, even if there's no alimony, you'll still pay child support." "Wait a minute," I shouted. "You're the one committing adultery." "Tom, this is a no-fault state. The court doesn't care who did what to whom. It only cares about the welfare of the children. In the case of a 4-year-old girl, the mother always gets custody." She paused to catch her breath, then continued. "If you don't believe me, find a lawyer and ask him. You'll realize I know what I'm talking about." Her tone softened. "You don't want this to happen, Tom. I don't want it to happen either. I want our family to stay together. This little adventure I've been up to shouldn't concern us. Just think about it." As I sat leaning back in my chair, she came over and kissed the top of my head. "Just think about it, Tom. Now I'm going to go to bed." With those words, she turned and headed up the stairs. I don't know exactly how long I sat like that. Thoughts flashed through my mind, and each of them evoked a different emotion. Anger, loss, bewilderment, sadness, perplexity, fear, rage, frustration. I felt like I had to make some plans, had to do something, but had absolutely no idea what. That Carol would cheat on me was unthinkable. That she would suggest continuing the affair was so far beyond my imagination that I felt paralyzed. I finally got to my feet and dragged myself up the stairs, exhausted from the roller coaster of events and emotions I had experienced tonight. I fell heavily into bed and fell asleep almost immediately. Even though I was exhausted, my body automatically woke up at 6 o'clock the next morning. Mechanically, I showered, shaved, and dressed. Wild thoughts flashed through my mind. Run away and hide, or wake Carol and shake her, or kidnap Susan, or just go to bed and never get up again. But when I went into Susan's room to look at her sleeping figure, I realized that for her sake I had to hold myself together. If I did something stupid, I would be in trouble and most likely lose all chance of keeping my beautiful daughter. I knew I had to put her first, to be strong for her sake. So I did my morning chores and headed to the office as I did every day. I was able to work on autopilot and complete all the tasks necessary to get to work. But as soon as I arrived and sat down at my desk, all reflexes left me and I put my head down on my desk in a daze. Tom? It was Lou. Are you okay? When I didn't answer, he walked into my office and closed the door behind him. What's wrong? He asked worriedly. And I told him every sordid detail of last night's conversation that I could remember. Once I started, I couldn't stop. Lou just sat there with a stunned expression on his face. He was shocked when I told him about what I'd seen in the green room, but he was taken aback by Carol's attitude toward her cheating. Damn it, he said. She has the nerve to ask you to just sit there and put up with her cheating. When I finally finished, he sat up and looked me in the eye. Look, he said, Carol has changed. I don't know what served it up. Maybe success has turned her head. But she's no longer the same woman I met when you moved here. And that means you have to change your attitude toward her. You can no longer assume that she has your best interests at heart. It's up to you to look out for yourself now, buddy. He stood up. The first thing you should do is consult an attorney. I can't believe she's getting away with shit like this. You can't rely on her word. You need to find out for yourself. Hell, Lou, I replied. I don't know any lawyers in Birmingham. That's where I come in handy, he smiled. My college roommate became a lawyer and he practices here in town. I bet he'd see you today if I asked him to. Let me go make a phone call. With those words, he left. A moment later, he returned to my office holding a piece of paper. You must like these old school friends, he exclaimed. You have an appointment for 1 p.m. today. Here's his name and address. He's expecting you. You're a lifesaver, Lou. At least it gives me something to do. No problem, buddy. After you meet him, come back and tell me what he said. The meeting with the lawyer did not go as I had hoped. He shook my hand and invited me into his office, then asked me to tell my story. I gave him the highlights and then got to what I really wanted to know. What are my options in a divorce? Tom, he said, there used to be a good guy and a bad guy in every breakup. The court would hear the two sides argue and then apportion blame. It was a no-win situation, he said, she said. It was impossible to determine who was right and who was at fault. Trials lasted too long. They were a drag on the judicial system. Eventually, someone came up with the idea of no fault. This meant that unless a crime had been committed, the court didn't have to worry about who did what to whom. All it had to do was decide on the equitable division of marital property and the welfare of minor children. Things just got a lot simpler. Okay, I said, but what does that mean for me? He sighed. In a nutshell, that means that what Carol told you is correct. Unless she turns out to be an unfit mother, using drugs, criminally neglectful, and the like, the court will give her custody of your daughter. We can try to get broad visitation rights, but Susan will live with Carol, and Carol will determine how often you will see your daughter. And even though Carol makes more money than you will still have to contribute to the cost of raising your daughter in the form of child support. What about the house? I asked him. He shook his head. Well, you both bought the house, so it's a joint property to be divided between you. But the court's primary concern is the welfare of the child, and the court doesn't like children being unnecessarily removed from the house. So the most likely outcome is that Carol will remain living in the house until Susan turns 18. After that, you both can put the house up for sale and divide the equity according to the final property division judgment. But for the next 14 years, the house will belong to her. But in a few years, she'll probably move on to another media market, I objected. Then you can sell the house. But until that happens, it stays put. I sat back and shook my head. Damn it, she knew exactly what she was talking about. I'm screwed. I'm sorry, he said to me as we shook hands. It's not always fair, but that's the law. As I drove back to the office, I felt like I had been sent to purgatory. I couldn't understand what sin I had committed, but I was sure I was being punished. Lou was eagerly awaiting my return, but with the look on my face, he already knew how it was going to end, and I didn't need to say anything. Damn it, Lou, I said. It's just not fair. She's put me in a predicament and there's nothing I can do about it. She can act like a whore, and unless I want to give up my daughter and my home, I'm going to have to suck it up and put up with it. I started pacing around the office. I'm beginning to understand why some men destroy their wives. Don't even joke about that, Tom, Lou said quickly. I know you want to cut her out of your life, but if something happens to her, I don't want to have to testify that you made threats here. Okay, I agreed. I can't and would never do anything like that. It's just that I feel like an ancient mariner and she feels like an albatross around my neck. As I passed the window in my office, I looked out and groaned. Across the street was a billboard that had just gone up. It had a huge picture of Carol and Ted Stevenson staring at me, with the caption, Birmingham's choice for the 6 o'clock news. See, I said to Lou, pointing at the billboard. I can't get away from her even here. Lou walked over and looked at the new sign. WXY definitely likes the rating these two are getting. Then a strange expression came over his face. Interesting, interesting, he muttered. Then he turned to me. How desperate are you to find a way out of this trap you've fallen into? Not desperate enough to resort to violence, I said. No, we're not going to commit a crime, at least I don't think so. But I have an idea that might solve your problem. The two of us sat and talked for the next hour. Several times I told him that he was crazy and that we could never do it. I pointed out to him that even if we did, it wouldn't work out. I reminded him that if things went badly, Carol would demand a divorce from me and would be vindictive as hell. To all of this, Lou kept asking, so how much worse off will you be than you are now? Thinking about it, I realized two things. First, I was stuck in a position that I absolutely could not bear, at least not for long. Second, I really had no choice but to do something truly desperate. Okay, Lou, I'm in. Perhaps as I left the office in the afternoon, my words sounded quite decisive. But as I drove to Mrs. Alsop's house to pick up Susan, I was overcome with doubt. I risked losing my daughter if I tried what Lou was suggesting. Wouldn't I be better off just swallowing my pride and living as a cuckold? Doing nothing was the easiest solution, no doubt about it. My thoughts and my stomach continued to churn as I brought Susan home and began to prepare dinner. For once, I'd left the TV off. I didn't think I could watch Susan and Ted interacting on the set, especially after what I'd seen a few nights before. Just as I was getting Susan ready for bed, I was surprised to hear Carol's car pull up. I knew it wasn't her turn to anchor the 10 o'clock news, but I assumed she'd stay to be with Ted. But then she came through the door, picked Susan up in her arms, and carried her delighted daughter to bed. I could hear the two of them laughing and giggling as Carol read story after story. Tears came to my eyes. This was what it was like in our house before everything went wrong. When Carol finally came downstairs, I looked up and said sincerely, "That was very nice of you. She misses you very much, especially before bedtime." "I know," she said, "and I missed her too." I wondered if she was having second thoughts about the new lifestyle she'd chosen. But all those hopes were quickly dashed in the next minute. The look on Carol's face now reminded me of a mother about to lecture her child on an unpleasant subject. "Tom, I wanted to come home early today so I could tell you about what's planned for next week." She took a deep breath and then continued. "I'm taking a vacation for next week. I've talked to Don Sanchez and he's fine with it. What's more, he advised me to take some time off. He says our ratings are so high that we can afford it." I was pleasantly surprised. A week together might be just what we needed to rebuild our marriage. "I'll have to check with my boss tomorrow, but I think I can get some time off," I said. "What do you mean?" She sighed. "You're not participating, Tom? Ted and I are going away alone. We're tired of having to sneak around. This is a chance for us to enjoy each other without worrying about anything else." I was stunned. I just sat there staring at her, not believing what I was hearing. "I've already cleared it with Mrs. Alsop. She'll keep Susan all day next week. All you have to do is drop her off on your way to work and pick her up at the usual time." She reached into her purse and pulled out a piece of paper, which she held out to me. "Here's all the information about where I'll be staying if you need to contact me. I'm sure Susan will be fine, but just in case. We're leaving on Friday. Maybe you can take Susan to the park for the weekend. She loves that. We'll be back on Sunday during the week and things will go back to a normal schedule." She looked at me a little unsure. I still hadn't said anything. "Okay, if you don't have any questions, I'm going to bed early tonight." Then, to my utter amazement, she came over and kissed me on the top of my head like I was a little kid. "Thanks for taking care of everything, honey," she said, and headed up the stairs. Oh my God, I thought. This has to be the most humiliating experience of my life. I was literally shaking with anger. There was no doubt in my mind. I had to do something to regain my manhood. Lou's crazy plan suddenly seemed like the best option. Friday, I got off work early. I wanted to be sure to see Carol before she left on her little trip with Ted Stevenson. I had already made arrangements with Mrs. Alsop to keep Susan overnight. If there was any yelling or swearing, I didn't want Susan to be exposed to it. I had already checked Carol's closet in the morning and found her suitcases, so I knew she would have to come home to pack. That would give me the opportunity I needed. When her car pulled into the driveway, I settled into my favorite chair in the living room and waited for her to come in. She opened the door and headed straight for me. She knew I was home because she'd seen my car in the garage. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "Is Susan okay?" "She's fine," I said soothingly. She's at Mrs. Alsop's. Then why are you here? She asked again. I wanted to make another attempt to convince you not to go away with Ted this week, I told her. She put her hands on her hips in frustration. I've already told you I'm going to go off and have my little affair with Ted Stevenson, and there's nothing you can do about it. As soon as we get back, it'll be over and everything will go back to normal. You just have to be patient and give me a chance to get it out of my head. But Carol, I whined, what about our wedding vows? What about leave everyone else behind? Those wedding vows were written in another time and place. No one believes all that nonsense anymore, she said with irritation. But you're talking about adultery, I insisted. I don't want you to dishonor our marriage. Her impatience and irritation were clearly growing. Tom, we don't need to discuss this anymore. If I want to go and entertain Ted Stevenson, I'll do it whether you like it or not. That's what I want to do. It has nothing to do with you and me. But I didn't want to do that. But Carol, what about your fans? All those people who watch you every night? You know they won't approve of what you're doing. I've clearly taken it too far. I don't care what my fans think. They're just a bunch of redneck dorks. Look, she went on, in 6 months to a year, I'll leave this provincial town and get a job in a real city where the streets don't turn down at night. In the meantime, what people here think means nothing to me. Now please stop pestering me. I've already made up my mind. I have to go and pack or I'll be late. And if you can't stand seeing me with Ted when he comes to get me, I suggest you get out of here right now. I stood up, slumping my shoulders. I'm sorry, Carol. I'm sorry for everything. I turned around, walked out to my car, and headed to the local tavern. I was shaking and I needed to relax. I was sipping my second beer when Lou walked through the door. Hey, buddy, he said with a grim smile. How'd it go? I don't know, Lou, I admitted. I was too close to him. You'll have to come and see for yourself. Not until I try the same thing you did, he said firmly. After he finished his beer, we both got into my car and drove back to the house. As I expected, Carol was long gone. We walked to my room and he sat down at the computer. When did you buy this thing back in the Stone Age? He asked. Nevertheless, with a few keystrokes, he was able to do what he wanted. Okay, he said, pointing at me. Let's see what we've got. He pressed another key, and Carol's image appeared on the screen. We listened as Carol flatly rejected my pleas to fulfill my wedding vows and told me exactly what she planned to do to Ted Stevenson. What a bitch, I heard Lou mutter under his breath. Then he listened to Carol's story about her fans and the city where she works, and the look on Lou's face became jubilant. We got her, man. That's a lot better than what we were hoping for. When the playback ended, Lou pressed another button, and we watched Carol again, but this time from a different angle. The second camera is very important, Lou said. It gives more realism. When the second playback ended, he FTP'd both files to his office. Then he pulled out a flash drive and made a copy of them. Backup copy, he said. Finally, he went to the bookshelf behind my chair and pulled out the 2 small cameras we had so carefully set up that morning. Once we were done with that, we both got in my car and headed back to the tavern so Lou could get his car. But when we got there, he surprised me by insisting that I follow him home. Edie's already made a big dinner, buddy. If you don't show up, she's going to be really pissed. I'd planned to spend the night alone, but Lou didn't want to hear about it. So I reluctantly got behind the wheel of his car and followed him home. When we walked through the door, Edie came up to me, gave me a hug, and kissed my cheek without saying a word. I wasn't sure if it was friendship or pity, but either way, I appreciated it. I'm sure dinner was wonderful, but I don't remember much of it. In truth, I was just picking at the dishes Edie had prepared, while Lou and Edie exchanged concerned glances. After that, they led me into their den, and Lou opened another bottle of wine. We sat and drank until Edie couldn't hold back any longer. I'm so angry and disappointed, Carol, I don't know what to say. She always seemed so sweet and loving. When did she turn into a selfish slut? Success seems to have changed her, and now she thinks she can do whatever, and with whomever, she wants. She turned sharply to Lou. Look, do whatever you can to help Tom. I don't like to take sides when friends divorce, but this is different. Carol is out of line, and we have to help Tom keep his daughter. She looked at her husband again with a piercing stare. And if you get hit on by one of those slutty models or TV personalities you have to work with, you better say no, or I'll come after your balls with a butcher knife. Lou and I laughed at Edie's threat, but I wasn't sure if she was exaggerating just to prove a point. We continued talking and drinking into the night, and eventually I collapsed on their couch. I vaguely remember Edie covering me with a blanket and patting my arm. The next thing I realized was the morning light coming through the picture window and the horrible taste in my mouth. Lou lent me a toothbrush and razor, and I did my best to make myself look half decent. By the time I was done, Edie had already made a big breakfast, and I sat down at the table with them. My appetite was a little better that morning. I guess my instinct for self-preservation kicked in. When I had finished and thanked them fervently for their kindness, Lou took my hand. "Look, Tom, leave everything to me. I've got a lot to do this weekend, and I need to get started. All you have to do is pick up Susan and get out of here. I'll keep you posted all the way." "Lou, I don't know what I would do if you weren't here," I said sincerely. With those words, I hugged him awkwardly and then headed home. I had one more thing to do, and I wasn't looking forward to it. When I got home, I checked our address book to get Ted and Missy Stevenson's number. When I called, the answer was, of course, Missy. "Hi, Missy, this is Tom Bailey, Carol's husband. May I come over now and talk to you?" "Oh, hi, Tom. Yeah, I think that would be good. Come on in." I heard the hesitation in her voice. We weren't that close, and I knew she was wondering why I wanted to see her. She'll find out soon enough, I thought grimly. As I drove up to her house, I tried to think about what I would say. It wasn't easy to tell a woman that her husband was cheating on her. And the fact that I didn't know Missy very well made the situation even more awkward. But I felt I couldn't let what was going to happen next take her by surprise. Missy went to the University of Alabama with Carol and me. She was even in Carol's sorority. She seemed nice, but she was 2 years younger than us, so we didn't have many opportunities to socialize. I was surprised to learn that she married Ted. Frankly, she wasn't his type. Anyway, we socialized with each other at a few station events, but otherwise Carol and I didn't socialize with each other. Except for Carol and Ted, I added bitterly to myself. When I arrived, she greeted me and offered me drinks. "Just a glass of water with ice, please," I asked. I was afraid my mouth would go dry when I delivered my grim news. When she brought me a glass, I took a sip and then set about my task. "Missy, do you know where Ted is?" I asked. "Of course," she said. "He's away at a TV convention. He'll be gone all week." "Why do you ask?" "Missy, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but Ted isn't at a televangelist convention. I found out that he and my wife are having an affair, and the two of them went to the coast to spend some intimate time together." Missy looked at me as if I'd punched her in the face. "That can't be," she protested. "I saw him off just last night." I could tell her thoughts were scattering by the minute as she went through her arguments. "He loves me. He wouldn't betray me like that." Another denial flashed by. "Carol was like an older sister to me. She wouldn't hurt me like that." Finally, she broke down and just looked at me helplessly. "Oh, Tom, are you sure?" I grimly pulled out my cell phone and turned on the video I had taken outside the green room. As she watched their erotic scene, her eyes began to redden, and then she started to cry. I didn't know what to do, so I sat down next to her, put my arm around her shoulders, and began gently stroking her back. "I know, Missy, I know." Suddenly she looked up, anger flaring in her eyes. "That bitch seduced him!" she shouted. "If you had her under control?" But she stopped her tirade when she saw my shocked face. "Oh, Tom, I'm so sorry, I didn't think—" "You lost your wife too, didn't you?" Missy's words brought my pain and loss back in full force, and the tears flowed again. We hugged each other helplessly, seeking comfort that wasn't there. Finally, we pulled away from each other. She wiped her face with the napkin she'd brought with the drinks, and then asked me, "What are you going to do now?" I felt I had no choice but to explain the predicament Carol had put me in, especially with regard to Susan. Missy, who had no children, realized at once the influence Carol had over me and grasped my hand sympathetically. "Oh, Tom, I never would have believed she could be so cruel and cold." Then she asked me again, "What are you going to do?" "Missy, I'm definitely going to file for divorce, but there are still a few things I need to do so I don't lose Susan. It's probably best if you don't know what those things are in case someone asks you about it later." "You're not going to do anything illegal, are you?" she gasped. "No, but if I succeed, both she and Ted will wish they'd never decided to cheat on us." I tried to smile slightly to reassure her, but I doubt it was convincing. "What about you?" I asked. "Do you think you two can rebuild your marriage? After what you just showed me? After I found out this has been going on for a hell of a long time? After I found out that he and that slut are going to spend a week together? There's no way I can stay with him and hold myself together again. In that case, you might want to use the lawyer I contacted, unless you already have someone you trust," I suggested. She gave me a weak smile. "No, I don't know who to turn to. I didn't plan on needing a lawyer. If you use my lawyer, it could save you money. At least he'll have all the evidence I have." I handed her the piece of paper I had prepared with my attorney's name, address, and phone number. If you contact him on Monday and let him know we're on the same page, he can process your paperwork at the same time as mine. She took the information and nodded. Missy, now I have a huge favor to ask of you. What is it? She asked nervously. All I ask is that you don't say anything to anyone, not your family, not your closest friend, not anyone until you hear from me. I looked directly at her. If you tell anyone, it could cost me the chance to keep Susan. She looked at me very solemnly, and I felt that she understood everything. I won't say a word, Tom. It will be hard to act as if nothing has happened, but I promise. I thanked her, stood up, and headed for the door. What are you going to do now, Tom? She asked. I smiled grimly at her and said, I'm going to pick up my daughter and take her out of town until all this settles down. She wished me luck, and I wished her the same. We're both going to need it, I thought. From there, I drove to Mrs. Alsop's house. When I arrived, she must have warned Susan of my arrival, because my little girl met me at the door and jumped into my arms. Did you have a good time, honey? I asked. Oh, yes, Daddy. I had a sleepover, and we had pancakes for breakfast, and then I played dolls. Holding Susan in my arms, I thanked Mrs. Alsop for staying with me and reminded her that Susan would not be coming to her house next week. Mrs. Alsop looked at me shrewdly and asked, Is everything all right, Tom? I looked at Susan and then back at Mrs. Alsop. I hope so, was all I said. She nodded and leaned over to kiss Susan's cheek. You take good care of that girl. She's like family to me. And Tom, I'll be praying for you. Thank you, Mrs. Alsop. It means a lot to me. With those words, I carried Susan to the car and put her in the car seat in the back seat. When we got home, Susan started looking for her mother. Where's Mommy? She asked me when she couldn't find her. I felt my throat constrict as I told her. Mom had to go on a trip. But you know what? You and I are going on a trip too. Where are we going, Daddy? She asked excitedly. We're going to Grandma and Grandpa's farm, I told her. She squealed and started dancing. Susan adored my parents and loved to watch the animals on their small farm in rural Alabama. Can we see the ducks and the little pigs? She asked. Sure, honey, I told her, and the sooner we get started, the sooner we can see them. Then I grabbed the bag I had already packed for her and my own suitcase, and we headed out to the car. I briefly considered leaving Carol a note about where we would be, but decided against it. She hasn't been thinking much of me lately. Why should I think about her? The drive to Mom and Dad's farm took a little over an hour, and Susan slept most of the way. But when we turned onto a rough gravel road, she woke up and started pointing at the horses and cows she could see through the car windows. When we pulled up to the house, Mom and Dad came out to greet us, and when we unbuckled Susan, she rushed into Grandma's arms and demanded to go see the farm animals. Mom took her hand and led her to the barn, but not before I gave her a concerned look. I took my bag, Dad took Susan's bag, and we went into the house to get them into my old bedroom. After that, Dad brought me into the kitchen and offered me a glass of fruit tea. It was already sweetened, and its flavor reminded me of my childhood. It seemed like those days were a long time ago. Okay, Tom, what's going on between you and Carol? Asked Dad bluntly. He'd never been one for small talk, and I could see the worry in his eyes. Let's take a walk, Daddy, and I'll tell you all about it. I had been waiting for this conversation ever since I called them and asked if we could come and stay for a week. They loved Carol and considered her the daughter they never had. I was sure how it would affect them. As we walked along the fence, I began to tell him the whole sordid story. He was silent most of the time, but I could see the pain in his eyes when he looked at me. Several times he gasped at what I had to tell him. Finally, I finished. There were tears in his eyes. I just can't believe Carol could do this. She's always been so good to your mom and me, and such a good mother to Susan. How could she become so callous and selfish? He turned and looked at me carefully. You know I've never doubted you, Tom, but could this be some kind of misunderstanding or a joke? I realized he was in denial and grasping at straws, but it was still a little uncomfortable. Then I thought, if I were him, I'd have to ask the same questions. Hell, I still have a hard time believing it myself. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I queued up the video I had taken in the green room and held it out to him. Watch this, Dad. When he took the phone, I reached over and pressed the arrow to start the video playing. He muttered to himself in a half-whisper. I can't make out almost anything that... Oh my God. I saw the picture come into focus. Carol's nearly naked body broke free from Ted Stevenson's embrace and began sliding down his torso, reaching for his belt, unbuckling it, and then unzipping his pants. I took the phone from him, and he stood there helplessly, his shoulders slumped and his face tense. Then he grabbed me and put me in a tight hug. "Oh, son, I'm so sorry. It hurts me so much to see this, I can't even imagine how you felt." We stood like that for a few more minutes, and then we turned and started walking back to the house in silence. He kept his hand on my shoulder the whole way. As we approached the house, I turned to him and asked, "Dad, can you tell Mom?" "I don't think I can do that." He nodded solemnly. "I'll do it," he said. Mom and Susan were in the kitchen having a snack when we came back. Mom looked at Dad, and when she saw his face, she was scared. She started to speak, but Dad raised his hand to stop her. "Son," he said, "why don't you take Susan to the pond so she can see all the little ducklings?" Hearing this, Susan jumped up and started tugging on my arm. "Let's go see the ducks, Daddy." "Can we go?" I nodded gratefully to Daddy and led Susan toward the pond. When we got back to the house, I saw that Mom had been crying. She wiped her eyes with a towel as we entered the house, then came over and hugged me tightly. "I love you, Tom. Dad and I will be there for you no matter what happens." "Thanks, Mom," I managed to whisper. Looking over her shoulder, I saw Dad and said, "Thank you, Dad. That means so much to me." We stood like that for a long time, and the silence was clearly beginning to bother Susan, who couldn't understand what was wrong. Then I turned to her and said, "Okay, Susan, let's go unpack. Then we need to wash up and get ready for dinner." That broke the spell, and she took my hand and began to walk nimbly back to our room, leading me behind her. I told myself that I would never lose my daughter, no matter what. The next day was Sunday, and we all went to the old Baptist church that Mom and Dad had attended for many years. As they say in the village, I had been an apostate for a long time, but I was glad to be in church again, to hear the familiar words and sing the old hymns. In the evening, I got a call from Lou. He brought me up to speed and told me all about what he had been doing that weekend. As I listened to him, I realized that no matter what happened, I was lucky to have a good friend like Lou, and that I would be indebted to him for a long time to come. I tried to tell him this, but I was uncomfortable expressing my emotions in the awkward way that men do in such matters. He brushed it off. "You would have done it for me." But he understood what I wanted to say, and I knew it. Then his tone changed. "Okay, Tom, so far this has all been just fun. Are you ready to put it into action? Once we get started, there's no turning back." I did not answer him at once, but paused to consider what we were about to do. There was no guarantee of success. In fact, even if we succeeded, it could still end badly for me. And if the whole thing blew up in my face, things could get ugly very quickly. I might very well have to work on my parents' farm. But then I thought about everything that had happened in the last 2 weeks. Through no fault of my own, Carol had humiliated me, put me in a position I couldn't bear. Even if I decided to subject myself to her desires, there was no guarantee that the situation wouldn't come to light, or happen again. And if it did, what would Susan think of me when she was old enough to understand? I didn't want to be such a model of a father to her. No, I thought, Carol had me cornered, and I had no choice but to fight back. And by God, that's exactly what I'm going to do. "Lou," I said, "let's do it." He must have realized what I was thinking just now because he didn't say anything while I sat there pondering. But when I told him I was ready, he simply replied, "If anything, Edie thinks you're doing the right thing." That kind of cheered me up. Now he was all business. "Do you have access to a computer?" I laughed and said, "My ancestors may live on a farm, but they don't live in the 1800s. "Okay, then I'll call you with information on where to find him tomorrow." "Why don't you just email me the link?" said I. "I can easily log into my email from here." "No," he said. "I don't want anyone to know about this. Just wait for my call tomorrow." That was goodbye, and I went to make sure Susan was sound asleep in her new bed. Keeping an eye on her had become my most important job. Lou called me mid-morning Monday morning. "When you get a chance to get some privacy at your computer, go to YouTube and type WXY into the search engine," he told me. "You'll find it. After you watch it, get back to me and tell me what you think." Mom and Dad took Susan out for a walk, so the timing was perfect. I went to the website and started searching. There were a bunch of videos, but one called WXYY co-host Carol Martin shares her personal philosophy on love and marriage caught my eye. When I pressed it, the familiar theme music for the 6 o'clock news came pouring out of the speakers, accompanied by the standard opening number that WXYY used every weeknight. But as the camera zoomed in on Carol, her voice faded out and a voiceover came on. Popular news co-host Carol Martin of WXY was recently interviewed by WXYY about her views on love and marriage. The screen switched to another image of Carol, and I heard her say, "Marriage is an institution that has been around as long as human society, But today, it is under siege like never before. I recognized those lines immediately. It was the beginning of a soft news series WXYY was running about the rising divorce rate across the country. But instead of continuing the series, which actually aired a few months ago, the voiceover came back. What are your views on the sanctity of marriage, Carol? Suddenly, the scene shifted to our den, where Carol stood and spoke. Wedding vows were written for another time and place. No one believes all that nonsense anymore. The scene froze, and the voiceover came on again. What about fidelity and constancy to your husband? What do you think about that, Carol? Carol's image on the screen spoke again. If I want to leave and hoot Ted Stevenson, I'll do it. That's what I want to do. Ted Stevenson's image flashed on the screen so that the viewer was left in no doubt as to who Carol was talking about. The invisible announcer returned. What about the public's opinion? Do you think most of the people of Birmingham who watch your news program would agree with you? Carol spoke again. I don't care what my fans think. They're just a bunch of boobs and redneck dorks. The announcer smoothly filled the sudden silence. That's certainly a controversial point of view, Carol. Aren't you concerned about how it might affect public opinion? Carol's image on the screen quickly prompted an answer. Look, in 6 months to a year, I'll leave this provincial town and get a job in a real city where the streets don't turn down at night. In the meantime, what people here think means nothing to me. Without a shadow of irony or judgment, the unseen voice continued. So you intend to engage in a sexual relationship with your fellow anchor, Ted Stevenson? Carol's response was unequivocal. I've already told you that I'm going to go off and have my little affair with Ted Stevenson, and there's nothing you can do about it. But this time, instead of a scene of Carol talking to me in our room, her voice came through on a video I was shooting on my phone in the green room. And as with my father, the scene went from two figures entwined in the darkness to a clear image of a barely clothed Carol dropping to her knees and beginning to undress the unmistakable figure of Ted Stevenson. The stage froze on the erotic scenes, and the voiceover returned for the last time. Now Birmingham viewers were left with only one question. Where are Carol and Ted this week? Then the WXYY news theme came on, the screen filled with a view of the newsroom with empty chairs, and the video faded out. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a strange mixture of triumph and sadness. I grabbed my cell phone and called Lou. Apparently, he recognized my number because he said in response to the call, "Well, what do you think?" "My God, Lou, you're a genius!" "This is going to be brutal. This video will cut her career open like a carving knife on a Thanksgiving turkey." "Not bad, eh?" "I have to admit, I'm proud of it," he said cheerfully. I began to feel a twinge of guilt, remembering what I had just seen. "Do you think we were too rough on her?" "Look," he said vehemently, "did she or did she not say all these things to your face?" "Yes," I replied, "but—" "No buts," he cut in. "She's turned into a selfish monster, and we need to show that to the rest of the world." Then his tone changed. "Look, Tom, you're a good guy at heart. I think in many cases you'd rather suffer yourself than make someone else suffer. But if you don't, it won't be you who suffers, but Susan. She'll grow up with Carol as her role model. You don't want that, do you?" I swallowed hard. "You're right, Lou. There really is no choice here. Thanks for helping me not to be confused." "So," I said, "what do we do next? Do we send out mass emails with a link to the video or what?" The beauty of the virus is that you don't have to do anything special to spread it. Once there is a source of infection, the flu virus spreads unaided, and very soon there is an epidemic. This video is our source of contagion. I may drop a hint to a couple people who like to gossip, but beyond that it will spread on its own. You just have to be patient. Okay, Lou, you're the expert on these things. Just keep me informed. For the next few days, Susan and I had a wonderful time visiting Mom and Dad. Susan had been to the farm before, but only for a day or two. Now that we had a whole week at our disposal, Dad and I wanted to give her a real sense of how the farm worked, and Susan began to learn where our food came from. At the same time, Mom took Susan into the kitchen and introduced her to cooking. Our food at home was more like open the package and heat the contents than real cooking. Mom cooked almost everything from scratch, and Susan loved to stand on the stool next to her and help add ingredients and stir them in large bowls. All in all, it was a wonderful week for Susan, during which she was exposed to many things she would not have encountered in our city life. Meanwhile, Lou called every day to keep me updated on how the snowball was starting to roll down the mountain straight at Susan. On Tuesday, he even chuckled when he informed me that Edie had learned about the video from a woman she worked with. On Wednesday, the video became a topic of discussion at the weekly Kiwanis meeting Lou attended. He swore he wasn't the only one who brought it up. In Thursday morning's paper, a local media columnist devoted a few short lines in her column to the video, mentioning it in vague terms. At the end, she wrote the following: "And the question on the minds of all of Birmingham this week is, where are Carol and Ted?" When he called me Thursday afternoon, Lou couldn't contain the glee in his voice. I talked to our media officer who handles WXYY. He said the whole station is in a panic. They're starting to get calls from other news outlets trying to interview Carol and Ted about the video, and the people at WXYY don't know what to do. Apparently, Don Sanchez is gone for a few days this week too, and no one knows where he is or how to contact him. On Friday, Lou directed me to an article on the media blog Gawker.com. It reported on the furor two WXY news anchors had caused in Birmingham and linked to a YouTube video. The article ended with a prediction that heads might roll. I called my attorney that morning and told him to file for divorce. I also arranged with him to have Carol served on Saturday at the country house in Gulf Shores, where she and Ted were spending time. It would cost me some money, but I figured it would be worth it. My hunch was more of a bet on certainty because I knew what Lou's next move would be. I also called Missy to let her know that I was filing for divorce and wanted Carol to be served with the summons on Saturday. I asked her if she wanted Ted to file at the same time. "No," she replied calmly. "I plan to do it myself when he finally gets home." I wished her luck. Other local Birmingham TV stations were insanely jealous of WXYY's success. They had learned of the gossip earlier in the week and smelled blood in the water when they viewed the video online. The only problem was how to play the story. Lou gave them the answer. He informed the news producer at the second highest rated channel that I was filing for divorce. This tidbit represented a real news event that they could use at their discretion without having to report what was essentially gossip. Then my attorney went on the sly. When the TV station reporter called to confirm the filing, the lawyer told her that the papers would be served on Saturday, and he managed to reveal the location where it would take place. Suddenly, the hounds were up in arms. The news director decided the story was too savory to ignore and decided to go full force. The station contacted the court server assigned to serve Carol, and they agreed to coordinate. Once everything was settled, the station manager authorized sending a video crew and lead reporter to Gulf Shores on Saturday. Lou called me Saturday morning with more news. Apparently, Don Sanchez had finally been contacted. He had cut his vacation short and was trying to make arrangements to get back to Birmingham as soon as possible. Lou's contact at WXY told him that everyone at the station was terrified. No one knew what was going to happen. Lou also advised me to be sure to watch the evening news on a competitor's station. "I think you'll find it interesting," he said with sarcastic understatement. Saturday is usually a slow news day, so TV stations are often grasping at straws for content. Apparently, that was the case that Saturday, because the news about Carol and Ted was the top story. The co-host, a somewhat smarmy type, went on the air with a picture of Carol and Ted behind him. It was a shot of a billboard I had seen from my office window the week before. All this week, many Birmingham residents have been concerned about the question, where are Carol Martin and Ted Stevenson of WXYY? In an exclusive piece today, we managed to find them in Gulf Shores, where they have been hiding all week. The scene switched to footage of the station's lead reporter, Hilda O'Reilly, a red-haired woman with a sharp voice, walking down the beach toward a couple sunbathing on the sand. It was Carol and Ted, of course. Neither of them heard the reporter, cameraman, and microphone operator until Hilda walks up to them and starts asking loudly, "Carol Martin, Ted Stevenson, what can you tell us about your relationship and the stories that are going around in Birmingham?" Carol let out a small exclamation of surprise and turned around to see who was talking to her. When she did, it was clear to the audience that she was sunbathing topless. When she saw the small crowd and the video camera, she cried out again and hastily covered her breasts, which of course were blurred on the TV screen to meet FCC standards. She turned away to match her bra to her bikini, and as she bent over to put it on, she discovered that her bikini bottoms were thongs. The camera then turned to Ted Stevenson, who was desperately trying to reach for his beach towel to cover the tiny Speedo swimsuit he was wearing. After cleaning herself up, Carol turned angrily to the red-haired reporter and shouted, "Hilda, what are you doing here? Why are you intruding on us like this?" Hilda didn't look the least bit embarrassed. "What do you have to say about the video that's all over the internet?" "What video?" asked Carol confusedly. "The one where you told all the rednecks in Birmingham that you came here to have an affair with Ted Stevenson," Hilda replied coldly. Carol began to sputter, and Ted tried to intervene and divert attention away from her. But just at that moment, The unlikely appearance of a man in a suit and tie on the beach caused everyone to pause. Approaching Carol, he asked in a loud voice, "Are you Carol Bailey Martin?" Reflexively, Carol answered, "Yes." "Then, Miss Martin," he said, handing her the envelope, "you have received notice. Your husband has also instructed me to inform you that the locks on your house have been changed, and you are no longer welcome there." With those words, he turned quietly on his heels and strode away from the beach. For a moment, Carol was stunned. Then anger flashed in her eyes, and she screamed, "That son of a bitch!" Being a television professional, Ted realized the cameras were still rolling and grabbed Carol, warning her in a low voice not to say anything else. He grabbed her arm and half led, half pulled her toward the resort. The camera focused on her oil-glistening buttocks as she angrily staggered away. The local announcer reappeared on the screen. "This is it." Carol Martin and Ted Stevenson, who have been missing all week, it turns out, were sharing a room at the posh Gulf Shores resort. And most interestingly, Carol's husband sued her for divorce and kicked her out of the house. "We tried to contact her husband but couldn't get a comment. They couldn't contact me because Susan and I were safe at my parents' farm, and I was going to stay there for the rest of the week. Although that meant I was safe from prying reporters for the moment, the only means of keeping up to date was Lou. Lou learned from his interlocutor on another Birmingham TV station that Carol had foolishly not believed the bailiff when he told her I had changed the locks and had asked Ted to take her to the house. It was a double mistake, because not only did her key no longer work in the door, but the TV station had stationed a camera crew to watch the house, and her embarrassment and frustration was caught on camera. It got worse. The next time she and Ted drove to his house not thinking about the consequences. Missy met him at the door with a packet of divorce papers and told Ted not to come back. A camera crew was also there, and Ted's humiliation was included in a news story for all to see. In desperation, they rushed around, trying to lose the tail of reporters, and ended up spending the night in a motel on Interstate 65, halfway to Tennessee. For the next chapter of the story, Lou had to turn to our media manager, who in turn got the information from his interlocutor at WXYY. Don Sanchez, WXYY's news director, finally got back to Birmingham on Saturday afternoon and tried unsuccessfully to contact Carol and Ted. They were, of course, on their way back from Gulf Shores with their phones turned off to avoid calls from other reporters. Don couldn't even leave a message. Carol and Ted's mailbox was overloaded with voicemail. The result of all this was a very angry news director. His composure didn't improve when someone showed him a tape of a competing network's exclusive Saturday night newscast. It wasn't until Sunday afternoon that Ted had the good sense to call the office, at which point Don sharply ordered the two co-hosts to report to the studio immediately. The two of them got back into Ted's car and went straight to the WXYY studio. When they arrived, they discovered that the competing station's remote broadcasting van was parked across the street, so they had to drive to the back of the building and sneak to the service elevator. With this little maneuver, they burst unannounced into a meeting Don was having with the rest of the staff. Apparently, the yelling started immediately, with Don berating the couple for their stupid, promiscuous behavior, and Carol and Ted trying to defend themselves. Finally, Don had had enough, and in front of the entire group, he told Carol and Ted that they were fired. "What?" screamed Carol. "You can't do that. We have a contract." Don went into executive mode and replied very coldly. "If you check those contracts, you'll see that there's a morals clause in them, requiring you to behave according to the norms of society." "What we do in private is nobody's business," Carol snapped back. Don, who was a practicing Catholic, stood up and leaned across his desk toward her. "When I was at Mass at the cathedral this morning, the priest spoke about the sanctity of marriage and the sin of adultery. He didn't mention you two by name, but he spoke of the bad example set by some public figures in our town." Carol recoiled at the thought of being the subject of local sermons, but Ted was still indignant, and he hastened to continue where wiser heads would have remained silent. "But nobody knows about us or cares for that matter." Now Don was getting sarcastic. "Obviously you didn't see the news on the other news stations last night. I suggest you get a copy and watch it." "But there's no need to wait. Just look out the window." With those words, he walked over to the window behind his desk and pulled back the curtain. Across the street was one of the billboards featuring the now infamous co-hosts. Carol took a quick glance at the sign, then took a double breath and looked more closely. "Oh my God!" she gasped. The sign had been defaced by a vandal who had the nerve and a can of spray paint. He hadn't done anything special, just erased some of the text, but now the sign proudly read, "Birmingham's choice for the 6 o'clock news is a whore." Don lowered the curtain and turned to the silent couple again. In an official tone, he said, "Your behavior has dishonored this station and caused irreparable damage to our ratings and reputation. I have no choice but to take you off the air immediately and terminate your contracts." He paused, then said bitterly, "Have you ever seen the original Frankenstein?" Confused by the change of subject, both nodded uncertainly. "Now," Don continued, "you are a monster, and the people of Birmingham are an angry mob. If I were you, I'd get out of town as soon as possible." I was very nervous as Susan and I drove back to Birmingham on Sunday evening. I had deliberately left late, hoping to avoid any confrontation with Carol or the media. As a result, I heard the news of Carol and Ted's dismissal on the Sunday evening news. But when I pulled up to our garage, it appeared that, having scored a famous victory, the opposing news teams had decided to leave the battlefield. The next morning, the Birmingham News broke a new scandal involving a city politician who was accused of embezzling public funds. The story pushed Ted and Carol to the back pages and kicked off a new witch hunt. Apparently, no one cared about the angry husband's reaction anymore. That morning, I took Susan to Mrs. Alsop's house. When I arrived, Mrs. Alsop met me at the door and gave Susan a protective hug. "Come on in, honey," she told her. "My children have missed you. They want to play." As Susan ran off to her little friends, Mrs. Alsop turned to me with a sympathetic look. "I was so sad to hear about everything that happened, Tom. I hope you and Susan are doing well." I thanked her for her sympathy, but I didn't have an answer for how things would work out for us. I thought it was telling that she didn't include Carol in her experiences. When I got to the office, everyone was friendly, but I felt like they were avoiding me. It was as if I had a terminal illness and no one knew what to say. The exception, of course, was Lou. He hugged me, and I hugged him back just as tightly. "You're a genius," I told him. "You're a master of the viral campaign?" "Well," he said, "it worked out better than we could have hoped. The only bad thing is that we'll never be able to tell anyone what we did." "That's good," I replied. "I know this is going to backfire on me, and I'm ready for it. Carol has already probably guessed by now that I must be the source of this video and is going to come after me with a gun in my hand. I don't want you caught in the crossfire." As it turned out, I had been too pessimistic in my expectations. My lawyer called me at the end of the week and informed me that Carol had decided not to contest the divorce. "But why?" asked I. "She'd already told me what she was going to do if I applied. And what happened?" "I spoke with Carol's attorney and she told me the rest of the story," he said. "Carol wanted to countersue for divorce and sue you for invasion of privacy, but her attorney talked her out of it. She noted that there are legal questions about whether a person can legally record their spouse's conversation. These issues become even more confusing when one spouse is a TV host, a very public figure. Anyway, she told Carol that her lawsuit may have to go all the way to the Supreme Court before it is finally resolved. She also reminded Carol that she's not very popular these days. She would have a hard time finding sympathetic jurors to hear her case. "What about Susan?" I asked. "Carol swore she'd try to take her away from me." My lawyer snorted. "Tom, your soon-to-be ex-wife is unemployed. Her chances of resuming her career not only in Birmingham, but in the entire state of Alabama are absolutely zero. What's more, I don't think she'll be able to get a job at a broadcasting company anywhere in the Southeast after the publicity she's gotten. She's now a poster child for unfaithful wives. With a reputation for immorality, no steady job, and no prospects in the entire region, what kind of judge can award her custody of a small child? The bottom line is that Carol is leaving town as fast as she can. You'll still have to split the proceeds of the house when it's sold, which could be any time between now and when Susan turns 18. And Carol will still have visitation rights with the children on holidays and birthdays. But she's giving up custody in your favor because she really has no hope of getting anything else. The only thing she wants is to be allowed to go into the house and get her personal belongings before she leaves town. One more thing, Tom, she'd like to be able to talk to you when she comes to your house. If she signs the papers on those terms, I think I can talk to her before she leaves town," I told him. We agreed that would happen at the end of the week. So it was done. I really did get everything I wanted. No, that's not true. What I really wanted was to get my life and my family back to the way they were before this whole terrible mess happened. But that was just wishful thinking. Once the avalanche starts coming down, nothing can stop it. But at least I had my daughter, and that was the only thing that mattered to me. The next night, Lou, Edie, and I celebrated over dinner. Susan had come too, and now she was sleeping in one of their beds while the adults continued the party. It wasn't really a party, just an opportunity for the three of us to reflect on all that had happened. I brought a bottle of the most expensive champagne I could find to toast my friends and thank them for their loyalty. Edie, in turn, raised her glass to the two of us. Guys, she said, when I heard about your scheme, I thought you were crazy. I thought everything would blow up in your faces and we'd have a big mess. The only thing that kept me from objecting was that you, she saluted me, were fighting for your little girl and had nowhere else to turn. And you, my loving husband, were so convinced you could handle it. So thank you both for fighting when you had to and winning despite the long odds. There, Lou and I agreed in unison. I felt I had to do one more thing before this whole dastardly scheme could be considered over. Check on Missy Stevenson. If anyone was an innocent bystander, it was her, but I knew she was suffering just as much, if not more, than everyone else involved. And I felt a little guilty for dragging her into the story, even though I had no choice and even though the real culprit was Ted. But at least I'd had a chance to make up my mind. Missy hadn't expected it. I called to ask if I could come over, and she invited me to lunch, so I figured she didn't hold too much of a grudge against me. We met at a quiet neighborhood restaurant, and after the waiter took our orders, I asked how she was doing. I'm afraid not very much, Tom, she replied. I still can't believe all this has happened. One day I'm happily married to a handsome, successful TV host, and the next day I'm divorcing a bastard who lied, cheated, and humiliated me in front of the whole town. I know, Missy, I comforted her. This is all so unbelievable. I feel like I'm caught up in a bad soap opera on daytime television. She wanted to know what was going on with Carol and me, so I told her the results of our divorce. Great, she said vindictively. She got what she deserved. What about Ted? I asked. What's going on with you two? That coward, she replied bitterly. He didn't have the courage or the courtesy to face me. He just left town, telling his lawyer to give me whatever I wanted. I have no idea where he went, nor do I care. Except, of course, that I keep waking up at night and reaching for him before I remember what happened. She pulled out a handkerchief and blotted her eyes. Are you going to be okay financially? I asked. Yes and no, she said. He left me a house, but it's too big for me to live in by myself. Plus, we have a big mortgage and no real funds, so I don't think I can afford to support him. Ted has to pay me alimony, but frankly, I don't count on it. The only way he'll be able to pay is if he finds a new job, and my friends have warned me that's not going to be easy. She sighed. Anyway, I think the smartest thing for me to do is to move in with my folks for a while, try to get a job and start to rebuild my life. She paused. That's not how my life was supposed to turn out, she said sadly. I felt terribly sorry for her. She was a sweet girl who didn't deserve anything like this. I begged her to stay in touch and let me know where she was. I really like Missy and I hoped she could pull through. She deserved it. The only thing left was Carol's visit, and I wasn't looking forward to it. The anger and resentment I'd felt earlier had subsided with the success of our viral video campaign. I felt like I had at least partially regained my manhood, and I no longer needed to fight with her or gloat over my victory. As a result, I decided to do something nice for Carol. I arranged for Susan to be with me when Carol's time came. As Carol got out of the SUV she had rented to move her clothes and other personal belongings, I saw the frown on her face. But when I opened the door and let Susan run up to her, the frown disappeared, turning into a smile and happy tears. As Susan threw herself around her mother's neck and hugged her desperately, Carol looked up at me and whispered, "Thank you." They entered the house and Carol began to play with Susan for quite some time. Officially, the visit was supposed to last only an hour, but I had mentally thrown that time out the window when I decided to invite Susan. When Susan had exhausted the list of things she wanted to show and tell her mother, Carol suggested she go up to her room and play. "I'll be up in a bit, baby. Daddy and I need to talk first." As soon as Susan left, Carol turned to me with some annoyance and said, "Thank you for that. I really didn't expect you to let me see her." I just nodded. Carol's mood changed noticeably. "I can't believe you would do this to me. You used a private conversation between the two of us to destroy me, to make me the laughingstock of the entire town. How could you do that?" I sighed. "Carol, I don't want to fight with you anymore. We're both not going to win anything." "Easy for you to say," she replied. "You're a winner. You cost me my job, my family, and my future, all to protect your fragile ego. Carol, I said I wasn't going to fight with you, and I meant it. I just want you to think about one thing. None of this would have happened if you hadn't decided to satisfy your own desires, regardless of anyone or anything else. Everything that happened, you brought it on yourself." Carol opened her mouth to answer, but at that moment Susan called out to her, asking when she was going upstairs. Carol looked at me for a moment, then turned on her heel and walked upstairs to her daughter. After playing in Susan's room for a while, Carol took her daughter into our bedroom and started packing up her things while continuing to talk to Susan. I could hear their happy chatter from downstairs. Finally, Carol came back downstairs, dragging her suitcases behind her, with Susan trailing behind. Carol put the bags in place and then turned and knelt in front of her daughter. Taking Susan by the shoulders, Carol told her, "Mom will have to leave. I'll be living in another state and won't be able to see you every day. But I promise I'll see you every chance I get, and we can talk on the phone and videotape each other for as long as you want." Susan immediately cried out earnestly, "No, Mommy, I don't want you to go." The girl threw her arms around her mother's neck and clung to her as if she were the only life raft in the ocean. Carol lifted her into her arms and stood hugging her tightly, stroking her back and trying to reassure her. "It's okay, doll. I'll see you soon and you'll tell me about what you've been doing and we'll have such a good time." As she spoke, she walked over to me and held out Susan. "Now you're going to be a good girl and do whatever your daddy tells you to do. I love you, Susan. Don't ever forget that." Then she turned, picked up her suitcases and walked briskly to the door. I could see tears streaming down her face, but she didn't let herself look back. Instead, she walked straight to her car, loaded her suitcases into the back seat, and with a quick wave of her hand, drove away. I hugged my sobbing daughter, and tears ran down my cheeks. I realized with surprise that they were caused not only by the loss of my daughter, but also by my loss. My little girl was losing her mother, and I was losing my wife. Finally, I lowered Susan to the ground. "Listen," I said, "I have an idea." "What, Daddy?" she asked with tears in her eyes. "Why don't we go to the park and see if the ducks are there? And after we do that, maybe we can find an ice cream man and buy an ice cream cone. Would you like some?" "Oh, yes," she answered immediately. "And we can feed the cones to the ducks, can't we, Daddy?" "Of course we can," I replied. I was greatly relieved to be able to distract Susan from her sadness. I knew there would be many more times she would miss her mom and the female presence in our home. But I hoped what I'd heard was true. Young children are more resilient and adapt to change more quickly than older children. And I thought regretfully, I hoped I could adapt too. The next week I learned that I would have to adapt even more than I had expected. Late one night, the head of the agency called me into his office. "Tom," he began, "you've done a tremendous job for us, and we sincerely appreciate your contribution to the success of the agency. I was just waiting for the but that I knew was coming. I didn't think I was going to like the direction it was taking. But this whole thing with your wife has left an odor that spreads all around. Clients ask if you're Carol's husband, and it has an impact on them even when I tell them your status. Not surprisingly, our relationship with WXY is also quite strained, and after all, they are a key media outlet for us." "Are you firing me?" I asked bluntly. I was getting annoyed and didn't want to listen to 15 minutes of entreaties. "Absolutely not," he said firmly. "But I've talked to the other supervisors, and we think it's best for you and the agency if you decide to seek employment elsewhere." "How much time do I have?" snapped back at me. "There's no deadline," he assured me. "Take as much as you need. And listen, Tom, I'll be happy to give you a glowing letter of recommendation. I hope it will make it easier for you to find one quickly." I didn't like it. It wasn't fair. But I realized that there was no point in burning bridges behind me, so I shook his hand, assured him that I understood everything and would start the search immediately, and thanked him for the offer of approval. Then I went back to my office. On my way out, I walked into Lou's office and closed the door. "What's up, buddy?" he asked. "I just got fired," I told him. "I guess all that heat we brought downstairs got too hot for the supervisors here." Then I told him about my conversation with the supervisor. "This is utter nonsense," he bellowed. "I'm going over there and I'm going to tell him what I think." "They can't do that to you, especially after everything you've been through." I took him by the shoulders and guided him back to the swivel chair. "You're not going to do anything but keep quiet." I don't like being thrown overboard, but I knew it was fraught when I started. "I won't let you get hurt. You've done too much for me already." I could see he wasn't happy, but he started to calm down and let me talk him out of the confrontation. We ended the conversation with me promising him to come over for dinner on Saturday. I told him I would come if I could bring a friend, and he looked shocked until I explained that she was 4 years old. Then I went back to my office and started updating my resume. As I worked, I shook my head regretfully. It looked like Missy wasn't the only party affected. I had several contacts at other agencies in the Birmingham area, and I immediately started calling them. However, after talking to a few of them, I realized that Carol and Ted's affair had left me as damaged goods in the area. Everyone liked me personally, but no one wanted to touch me with a 10-foot pole. It was time to widen my search. Eventually, I went back to my old agency in Mobile. It was far enough away that I didn't have a trail of scandal following me, and the agency was happy to get a proven employee with big city experience. Of course, I had to sell my house in Birmingham, and even though the market there was better than many others, I got very little to show for my investment. And of course, what I got had to be shared with Carol. Carol, of course, did not disappear from our lives. She started calling Susan every week and quickly moved to Skype so they could see each other. Neither of them was content to be limited to electronic contact, but face-to-face meetings were out of the question since Carol now lived in Santa Ana, California. Apparently, our video attack on Carol had a bigger effect than we could have imagined. At job interviews, even outside the Southeast, she began to be asked questions about what had happened. She continued to look for work out west, but was never able to shake off her reputation. Eventually, she came to the conclusion that it was time to hang on to her dreams of a career as a TV presenter. She managed to get a job teaching journalism at Santa Ana College in California. The job didn't bring the pay or the joy of being an anchorwoman, but she was grateful to be working in a related field. When I finally reconnected with my old agency in Mobile, I was faced with the next task of finding a place to live. My new employer put me in touch with a real estate agency, and they assigned a new agent, Marilyn Elliott, to show me several properties. I was supposed to meet her at the first house on the list, but when I pulled up to the address, she had already overtaken me because she came to the front door as I was parking. Something about her appearance seemed strangely familiar, though the name Marilyn Elliott meant nothing to me. When I got close enough to be sure, I exclaimed in surprise, "Mrs. Stevenson." She smiled and came over to greet me. "What a pleasant surprise, Tom. When I saw your name, I thought it might be you, but I figured it was just a coincidence." "Oh, and Marilyn Elliott is my maiden name, but everyone who knows me still calls me Missy." Missy had a list of half a dozen houses she wanted to show me, and as we went from place to place, we recounted to each other everything that had happened in the last few months. I didn't realize that Missy's family lived in Mobile. She had moved there shortly after Ted left. Apparently, the new career she had started was in residential real estate. I, in turn, told her my story, which ended with my firing from the Birmingham agency and subsequent move to Mobile. When I mentioned Susan and the need to find a preschool for her, Missy got excited. "I know of several places that I'm sure would be perfect for her," she told me. "I also know of some great children's activities in the area that I'm sure she'll enjoy. You'll have to introduce her to me." Then she blushed, perhaps feeling that she was speaking too frankly. I was glad for any help that would help Susan move into her new home and neighborhood. I really enjoyed our conversation, and as the afternoon in our day of exploring drew to a close, I asked Missy if she could join me for dinner. Just to talk about the houses we had seen, of course. She quickly agreed. I had never paid much attention to Missy before. She was 2 years behind Carol and me, so I had only limited contact with her. And when Carol came to WXY, Missy was married to Ted. But now, listening to her over dinner, I found myself wondering. She had always been pretty, but not glamorous like Carol, but like a girl from the neighborhood backyard. Now I found her not only attractive, but smart and easy to talk to. She was unaffected, speaking simply and sincerely. After spending a long time with many television personalities, I found Missy's simplicity and naturalness very attractive. Our conversation returned to the subject of real estate, and she asked me which of the houses we had seen today I liked. I told her there were several that I liked. I then asked which one she would recommend. I expected her to recommend the most expensive house we'd seen. After all, she's a commission-based salesperson. But she surprised me by pointing to a sheet describing a more modestly priced house. "Why this one in particular?" I asked. "Oh," she replied ingenuously, "that's exactly where I'd like to live." Then she realized what she had said and was embarrassed. The thought flashed through her mind. That would be nice. I won't belabor the point. Missy and I were married, and yes, we lived in a house she liked. I was apprehensive about how Susan and Missy would get along together, but my fears proved unfounded. Missy, I learned, had wanted to start a family ever since she and Ted had gotten married. But Ted had refused, believing that a child would stunt his development. So when she met Susan, it was love at first sight. As for Susan, it was obvious that she lacked female influence in her life. When Missy started showing up at our house, Susan treated her like a duck to water. Even before we were married, Susan started calling her Missy's mom, and soon Missy was dropped. The summer after the wedding, I did something I had long thought I should do. The three of us flew to Los Angeles so Susan could see Carol again. My plan was simple. Susan would spend a week with Carol, and Missy and I would go sightseeing in Los Angeles. None of us had ever been there before, and we were looking forward to being typical tourists. At the end of the week, the three of us will reunite and fly home to Mobile. I hesitated to broach the subject with Missy. No second wife could be happy enough to have her husband dating his first wife again. Besides, Missy had good reason to dislike Carol, given everything that had happened. But when I hesitantly brought it up, Missy simply said, "I think that's a great idea." I think she was more confident in our marriage than I thought, and perhaps a little more mature about what had happened than I was. Anyway, we arrived at John Wayne Airport, and Carol was there to meet us. Although I had seen her face many times on Skype, I almost didn't recognize her standing in the terminal. She had a short haircut and was dressed in what I would call business casual clothes. It turned out that a lot had changed. Susan suddenly became very shy, clung to Missy's waist and hid her face. But Missy gently nudged her toward her mother and whispered encouraging words in her ear. Finally, Susan let go of her arms and hesitantly walked toward Carol, picking up speed as she approached, and finally hugged her. Carol was crying profusely, and Susan was confused and worried at first. "I'm just so happy to see you," her mother reassured her, and they hugged each other tightly. Carol looked at Missy and me and whispered, "Thank you" to each of us. I couldn't help but think of the parting scene as Carol left Birmingham for the last time. This time the four of us went to the baggage claim area. When Susan stopped to admire some of the items in the window of one of the airport stores, Carol turned to the two of us. "I know we don't have much time, but I want to apologize to both of you. I've been doing a lot of thinking over the last couple years. I even went to a therapist. She helped me realize what I had become in my pursuit of stardom and how much I had hurt those around me, especially you two. You probably won't be able to forgive me, but I hope you won't hate me." Missy and I looked at each other and then moved in unison to hug Carol. It felt good to let go of a lot of things. After we returned from vacation, I called Birmingham one evening. When Edie answered, I chatted with her a little about our life and then asked to speak to Lou. When he came over, we exchanged pleasantries, and then I told him why I was calling. "You were willing to take a chance on me once. Are you willing to do it again?" "What the hell are you talking about, Tom?" "I'm talking about you quitting your job, moving here, and starting an advertising agency called Bailey and Faraday. What do you say?" "There is only one way in which I would contemplate such madness," replied my old friend. "What's that?" "We'd have to rename the company Faraday and Bailey." We both laughed and started making plans. After the way I'd been treated at the old agency, Lou wasn't happy there. He was hungry for something new, and my call came just in time. We brought them both to Mobile, and Missy helped them find a beautiful home near us. The fact that she refused to take a commission made it a little easier for them to come up with a price. Shortly after Lou and I opened the store, we were talking about our services to a potential client. The guy really liked our approach. "Yeah," he said. "I wanted to try a different approach, something to make us stand out from the crowd. Maybe something like a viral campaign. Can you guys pull off something like that?" Lou and I just smiled at each other. "Yeah," I said, "we can handle it. Thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe to my channel and watch for the next video.